but the man would not unclench his fists. And so these three men yelled out to the police that happened to be nearby. They ran over and jumped on top of this guy and handcuffed him. And the man, as he's laying on the ground, is yelling out that he did nothing wrong. And then onlookers would say he began moaning very strangely before he began violently vomiting before falling unconscious. While the police waited for emergency services to show up and take this man to the hospital, they were able to open up his fists and discovered the only thing he was clutching was his own bank card that was now bent in 3 places. The wallet he had on him belonged to him, and the bags that were lying on the ground all around him only contained some pet supplies that he had recently purchased. It did not appear he had actually taken anything from this woman. And speaking of this woman, the police were so caught up in the chaos of the moment that they hadn't even thought to look around for the victim to see if she was okay. So they poked their heads up and start looking around the crowd for this woman, but she's nowhere to be seen. And so they asked the crowd, do we know who she is or where she went? And nobody knew. The police did think it was odd that this woman had walked off without talking to them first. But they figured if she walked away, then everything must be fine. And so they labeled the incident an attempted robbery, and they closed the case. The following day, the older man, who became known as Mr. A by police, died at the hospital as a result of heart failure caused by extreme stress. When the police found out about this, they simply went into the case file, updated it to show the suspect had died, and did not investigate further. But Mr. A's family refused to believe he had just attacked a young woman and her baby. It was completely out of character. He was a gentle retiree who had spent 40 years working for a chemical manufacturer and now was collecting a pension and working part-time as a security guard. He lived with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren, and he lived about a kilometer away from the Jusco, where he had gone that day to get some hamster food for his grandson's hamster. His family pleaded with police to reopen the case and investigate this woman because she must have done something to start this altercation. The police initially resisted, but ultimately conceded and said, okay, we'll check the CCTV camera footage at the Jusco to make sure we didn't miss anything. And what they discovered terrified them. A camera overlooking the ATM bank where this whole scuffle went down picked up this woman about 5 minutes before Mr. A walked into frame. She was standing in a corner just off to the side of the ATMs, and she did appear to have a 2-year-old or 1-year-old strapped to her chest, and she was just standing there motionless with her back to the corner looking down. And then when Mr. A came into frame, he appeared to pull some money out of the ATM. He had bags all over his arms. He turned around after getting his cash and started walking away. And as soon as he does, the woman in the corner suddenly becomes animated. She lifts her head up and walks straight past him, skimming his chest with her hand as she passed. And right after she did that, it was like Mr. A had a reaction to being touched by her. And he instinctively grabbed her arm, and that's when the struggle ensued. And that's when the woman yelled out, "Thief!" Although it's clear from the footage that she is the aggressor, not Mr. A. And then at some point, the 3 men jump out of the crowd, they pull him to the ground, the police show up, and then at some point during this chaotic melee, the woman just stands up and meanders her way into the crowd and disappears. Although the police searched every piece of footage in and around this ATM all around the time of the incident, they never found any footage of this woman entering or exiting the Jusco. It was like she just appeared in that corner in order to go after Mr. A and then vanished as soon as it was done. And none of the dozens of witnesses that watched the scuffle take place right in front of them in broad daylight were able to provide any sort of meaningful description of this woman. It was like nobody got a really good look at her. But after reviewing hours and hours of the CCTV footage, the police did find one instance where this woman, for 1 second, looked up at a camera exposing her face. And her face was so unsettling to police that they actually decided not to share the image with the public for an entire year. They were scared that if people saw this image, it would scare them from ever going back to Jusco. This is the image of the woman. As you can see, her face is totally emotionless, her eyes are blank and downcast. Some have compared her face to a death mask, which is a plaster cast of a dead person's face. Other people have said she doesn't even look human. After seeing the CCTV footage, Mr. A's relatives sued the police for detaining him and pinning him to the ground despite his obvious medical distress as a result of whatever this woman did to him. Eventually, they did reach a settlement, but what they really wanted was an explanation for who this woman was. But even after the police released this strange photo to the public, nobody ever came forward, so she was never identified. And it's unlikely she'll ever be identified because the statute of limitations for this case expired in 2011. The case, which is now referred to as the Jusco Phantom, is still very famous in Japan, and it remains a popular topic on long internet chat room threads where people exchange this eerie photograph and speculate about who or what killed Mr. A. In 2010, Sam Ballard was a 19-year-old living in Australia. He was a college student and a standout rugby player. His mother described him as being invincible. One night, Sam and his buddies were over a friend's house having what they called a red wine appreciation night, where they sarcastically pretend to be grown-ups by only drinking wine instead of beer. And after hours of drinking and joking around, they were standing in the backyard on the patio when they noticed a small slug crawling across the ground. And at some point, one of the boys yelled out, "Hey, someone should eat that!" But no one was taking him seriously, and everyone just kind of joked about it. But Sam took it as a challenge and said, "You know what? I'll eat the slug." And everyone's like, "No way, you're not going to eat that slug." But them telling him he wasn't going to do it only egged him on, and so he picked that slug up, threw it in his mouth, and he ate it. And the boys howled with laughter. They were so impressed, and for the rest of the night, he was the king. The next morning when Sam got up, he noticed a dull ache in his legs. He attributed the pain to his hangover and expected it to clear by the evening. But by the end of the day, the fog of his hangover had gone away, but the pain in his legs had not. The following day, when he woke up, the pain was not only still there, it had intensified. And so he told his mother about it, and her first concern was that he could be developing multiple sclerosis, something his dad had. Sam was concerned about that too, but he also told her that he had eaten this slug, and he was concerned that, maybe this could be some sort of allergic reaction to that. And his mother said, "You know what, you got nothing to worry about with the slug. Nobody gets sick from things like that." So they went to the doctor, and multiple sclerosis was very quickly ruled out, which was a huge relief to the Ballards. But the doctor said they didn't really have a good reason for why Sam was experiencing this leg pain. Sam brought up the fact that he had eaten this slug, and even though his mom didn't think it was a big deal, he was wondering if maybe this could be an allergic reaction. And the doctor said that off the top of their head, they had no idea if the slug had anything to do with his leg pain. But a couple of days later, the doctor called Sam back and said they had had a chance to do some research, and they spoke to their colleagues, and it looks like Sam had something called rat lungworm disease. This is an infection most commonly found in rats that's caused by a parasitic worm that can be passed down to snails and slugs if they eat the rat feces that contains the parasite's larva. Based on Sam's symptoms, which now included persistent dizziness and vomiting, the doctor informed him that most likely the slug he consumed at that party was a carrier of the parasite. The doctor informed the Ballards that most people who contract rat lungworm disease do so from eating undercooked or raw snails, and they recover without incident once the parasite dies. But in very rare cases, the parasite can penetrate the intestine, traverse the nervous system, and then burrow itself into the outer lining of the brain, causing patients to suffer from a very rare form of meningitis that can be deadly. Sam and his family were told there wasn't much anybody could do to help treat his symptoms, and so all they could really do was just wait to see how severe his case was going to be. And unfortunately, Sam's was extremely severe. Just a few days after his diagnosis, Sam did develop the rare form of meningitis, and he slipped into a coma for 420 days. When he finally woke up, he was paralyzed, he wasn't able to speak, and he couldn't eat without a feeding tube. He required care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But the disease did not affect his mental faculties. He was just as sharp as ever. One of his best friends, Jimmy Galvin, who was there the night Sam ate the slug, said he went into Sam's room after he came out of his coma, and he told Sam how sorry he was that he didn't try to stop him from eating the slug. And although Sam couldn't speak or react in any way, he cried because clearly he had understood what Jimmy had told him. Sam was eventually released from the hospital in a motorized wheelchair 3 years after being admitted. He would only live another 5 years before the infection claimed his life. Sam kept a copy of the Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places You'll Go, close to him over the 8 years following his diagnosis. The book was Dr. Seuss's final salute, offering encouragement to children as they deal with life's inevitable obstacles. Over the years, as he struggled with his severe disabilities, his friends and family would read from this book, willing him to make the best of the challenges he was facing. And then as his friends and family said their final goodbye at his funeral, the book was read one last time. When Conrad Rowland was a little kid, he was always on the go. One time when he was at the grocery store with his mother, he leapt out of the cart and ran away from her, and she found him stuck inside of a freezer. After that incident, she literally made him wear bells on his shoes when they were out in public so she didn't lose track of him. But by the time Conrad was just 4 years old, he had discovered athletics. And instead of putting his energy into running away from his mom, he focused it exclusively on baseball, basketball, soccer, and tennis. And by the time he was 11 years old, he was an exceptional all-around athlete. And at the time, his school announced they were going to have this special guest speaker at an assembly, and it turned out to be the Hall of Fame baseball player Rod Carew. And Conrad was just blown away. He just could not believe he was in the presence of an actual professional athlete, let alone a guy that had achieved the success Rod Carew had. And so after this assembly, when he got home, it was all Conrad could talk about, was just how incredible Mr. Carew was and how he, Conrad, was gonna be a professional athlete just like Mr. Carew. For many kids, this would just be a phase. They'd be really invested in sports, and then their interest would go somewhere else and they'd kind of forget about it and it would not be their life calling anymore. But for Conrad, the impression Rod Carew left on him was so profound that he never wavered. He really did dedicate himself to becoming a professional athlete, and he would be successful. Albeit in a different sport, he became a professional football player in the NFL. And in 2012, Conrad started nearly every game for the New York Jets at tight end. It was like his professional career was going off without a hitch. But in 2013, he injured his knee, which sidelined him for about 2 years. And even though he diligently rehabbed and got back to full strength, the teams were not really ready to take a flyer on him because they were worried his knee would just give out again. He continued to train extremely hard in hopes of landing another contract, but his playing career was starting to look bleak. During the 2016 offseason, Conrad was back home in California visiting his family. One night, as his mother, Mary, was making dinner, Conrad was sitting at the table filling out his driver's license renewal form. And when he got to the section where it asked him if he wanted to be an organ donor, he stopped. And he asked his mother, are you an organ donor? And she would say, yeah, I am. And so Conrad said, okay, then I will be too. And he checked the box. And Mary remembers thinking, gosh, I really hope it never comes to that. A few months later, Conrad was working out in a local gym getting ready for the next season when he developed a sudden and severely painful headache. He tried to keep working out, but he just could not do it. So he stepped aside and he called his mom and he told her that he felt this weird click in his head and then he felt this blinding pain behind his left eye. His mother told him he needed to go to the hospital right away. And so that day, Conrad went over to the UCLA Medical Center where they quickly diagnosed him with a brain aneurysm. A brain aneurysm is the bulging or ballooning of a blood vessel in the brain. If the aneurysm bursts, it's fatal about 50% of the time. And for the people who survive a ruptured aneurysm, most likely they will suffer from significant neurological deficits. After his diagnosis, Conrad remained positive and assured his family he was going to kick this thing's butt. But on December 12th, just 4 days after he was admitted, Conrad's aneurysm burst and he never regained consciousness. Because Conrad was an organ donor, the doctors kept his body on life support and they called the recipients at the top of the donor lists. One of them was a man in his 70s who a year earlier had suffered a massive heart attack and desperately needed a new heart. When he and his wife got the call, they were shaking. They couldn't believe it. His life was about to be saved. They already lived right near Los Angeles, so they hopped in their car and they sped to the UCLA Medical Center, and shortly thereafter, news out of the operating room was the transplant had been a success. The man Conrad's heart had just saved was none other than Baseball Hall of Famer Rod Carew, Conrad's childhood hero that had pushed him to become a professional athlete. At first, the families had no idea, but eventually this incredible link was discovered and immediately the two families bonded. Today, because Conrad's family only lives 12 miles away from Rod Carew and his family, Conrad's mother was given a standing invitation by the Carews to stop by anytime she wanted to listen to her son's heart. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please get a job at the like button's favorite Starbucks just so you can give them a severely burnt coffee every morning. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Twitter or on Instagram. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Far and away, the scariest part of the story is Jason's when he brings the Dybbuk box home and he goes to bed that first night and then the following night what he sees in his living room. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, at the next solar eclipse, offer the like button a pair of children's cardboard 3D glasses and tell them that they can look directly at the solar eclipse with these on. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In 2003, Kevin Mannis owned an antique shop right in downtown Portland at the base of the Burnside Bridge, which is considered the gateway to the city. Because Kevin owned this antique shop, he was always at yard sales and estate sales looking to find the next thing he could sell at his shop. And so one day there was this estate sale over at this woman's house. She had just passed away. She was about 103 years old. She was a Holocaust survivor, and her estate was being sold. And so he goes over to the house and he sees the way they're selling all of her items is by bundling them in different lots. So depending on what item it was, they'd be bundled with similar items and then sold as a package. So the people there would be bidding on the whole lot. They couldn't buy individual items. And Kevin had his eye on one particular lot called Lot 29, and Lot 29 included a couple of small tools that he wanted to sell in his shop, and it had this mystery box, and that's exactly as it was labeled. It just says mystery box on it, and he was intrigued by it. And so he placed a bid on Lot 29, and ultimately he won the bid, and he's really happy about it. So he takes the contents of Lot 29 and he wheels them over to his car, and as he's loading stuff into the back of his car, someone behind him says, "Oh, so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" And Kevin in his head went right back to his childhood, because growing up, he had always been scared of Dybbuks, because a Dybbuk is a malevolent spirit in Jewish folklore, and Kevin was Jewish, and so his parents used to say, "Oh, you better not do that, Kevin, or the Dybbuk's gonna get you." And so he grew up terrified of Dybbuks. And so his interest is piqued. And Kevin turns around and he says, "Did you just call this box a Dybbuk box?" And the woman's like, "Yeah, and my grandmother was terrified of it, and she said no one could ever open it." And Kevin turns to look at the box, and it's about 2 foot high by 1 foot wide, and there are these little doors that swing open on the front, and then on the bottom there's a drawer that comes out, and there's one lock that sits across the 2 doors, and it's currently locked with a little padlock. And he looks up at her and he goes, "Why can't you open it?" And the woman just says, "We never knew, but our grandmother would always go every time we said the word Dybbuk, and so it was weird enough that we just never asked any questions and we stayed away from her Dybbuk box." Kevin agreed that was pretty weird, and he finished loading his car, shut the trunk, said bye to the woman, hopped in his car, and he drove away. And he never really gave it a second thought. At this point, he's not thinking the Dybbuk box is anything malevolent. He thinks it's just some random chest that he won at an auction. Kevin drives back to his antique shop and he begins unloading all the things he won at the auction. He brings them inside and he brings them downstairs, because the top floor, the main floor, was really where he sold things. When he got new items, he would bring them downstairs to his warehouse of sorts, which was much bigger than the first floor, had lots of rows of shelving, and it had a workstation down there. He would bring his new things down there and he would price them and get them ready before bringing them back up. And at some point, he brought the Dybbuk box in and he brought it down and he put it on the back table. He was about to just leave it there and go back upstairs when suddenly he became really curious and he really wanted to open the Dybbuk box. And so he goes over and he kind of yanks on the front 2 doors. He doesn't want to damage it, but he can tell this lock is relatively new and it's not just going to come off. And so he doesn't have the key to it, and he doesn't have a way to clip the lock. And so he takes a screwdriver and he basically wedges it underneath the actual metal clasps that are attached to the wood. And he slowly kind of bends it up and bends it off and pops it out of the wood. And as soon as he does that, the doors swing open and there's like a mechanical device inside of the Dybbuk box that activates the drawer. Basically, anytime the doors open, the drawer also opens at the same time. And Kevin remembered thinking how silly it was that this kind of old, crummy-looking wine closet had this fairly complicated mechanism inside of it that still worked. Inside the Dybbuk box were 2 pennies from the 1920s, there was a used candle, there were 2 locks of hair, there was this small tombstone that said Shalom on it, and there was also a small wine goblet that was inside, and that was it. And Kevin immediately thought, well, this is just some older woman's keepsake, and these things maybe have sentimental value to her, but they don't to me. And so he shut the Dybbuk box, pushed it to the side of the desk, and walked upstairs and didn't give it another thought. Kevin had one employee at the antique shop. Her name was Jane. She was a younger woman. She was an incredible saleswoman, and Kevin thought very highly of her. And so the day after he had brought the Dybbuk box into the antique shop and put it downstairs on the desk, he needed to run out and do some errands, and so he put Jane in charge of the store. And so Kevin leaves, and Jane locks the front door to the shop behind Kevin because she needed to go downstairs and get a few items that she wanted to bring upstairs to sell that day, and it was before opening time. So front door's locked, no one else is inside the shop, and Jane goes down into the basement. Once you went down the wooden steps into the basement, you'd be looking out at this huge room of all these industrial shelves that run the length of the room where they would keep their antiques and other valuables on. And the lighting down there was never that great because they used these long fluorescent tube lights that at best cast a kind of subtle yellow glow on everything. They were not particularly bright, and it was a real pain to actually go up and change them because you needed to place a ladder, but the ladders were not perfectly aligned with the lights. You basically had to reach over the shelving where all the antiques were, and you ran the risk of knocking things over. And so a lot of times Jane and Kevin would wait until you were down to like 1 or 2 crappy working lights before they'd say, okay, we really got to go up there and replace some of these bulbs. And so as it happens, this day, they're down to like 2 or 3 working lights. So in classic horror movie fashion, she's going into this dingy basement with very poor lighting. And so once she gets to the bottom of the steps, she walks to the far end of the room, a little bit away from where the Dybbuk box was placed on that back table. She's in the other corner in the back of this basement, and she's getting some things off the shelf when all of a sudden she stops. And she can't help but shake the feeling that she feels like someone is watching her. Now, she is down in this basement all the time, whether it's well lit or dark, whether Kevin is there with her or she's alone. This is a place she goes all the time, and she's never had this feeling before. There's no way to get into the basement unless you come down the stairs, and she locked the front door, and she was the only one who came downstairs. She hasn't heard anything. There's no other way to leave this space, so she doesn't know where she's getting this feeling from, but she really can't shake it. And as she's kind of looking around and she's starting to get a little bit paranoid, the phone rings. They had a landline that was on a table right at the base of the stairs. The phone rings down there and it startles her. And then it kind of jumps her back into reality, and she's like, okay, I'm getting paranoid. And she walks over and she picks up the phone, and it's actually her friend who was planning on coming by the antique shop that day. So as they're chatting, Jane hears what sounds like a broom. Imagine if a push broom is lined up against the wall and then it falls over, the sound that the wooden stick would make as it hits concrete. That's the sound she hears as she's on the phone. And it startles her again, and she goes, hey, let me call you back. She hangs up on her friend and she's looking out, and because the lighting is terrible from where she is, she's now at the foot of the stairs looking down all these rows, and she's heard that stick land on the ground on the far side back where she had been originally. She's kind of looking around and she can't see anything. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the rows to see what fell over. And as she's walking down the row, something smashes behind her, and she turns around, and one of the fluorescent tube lights has fallen from the ceiling and smashed onto the ground. And so all of a sudden she doesn't want to explore this falling broom that's behind her in the dark corner of the basement. Instead, she's ready to leave. And so she starts walking back towards the stairs to get out of here. And as she's walking down one of these rows, a wooden chair that is on one of the shelves comes flying off of it and lands squarely in the middle, blocking her path. And there's no way this could have happened unless someone pushed this chair. And suddenly she thinks, someone's down here with me. And she screams and she hurdles the chair and she runs to the steps. She starts running up, and to her horror, there is a metal door that locks the basement at night. So if someone were to break in, it's another layer to protect the store from thieves. And it was shut and locked. It can only be locked from the outside and with a key. So there's no way she would have done this by accident, and now she's freaking out because she's trapped in the basement with some person running around, pushing chairs over and breaking lights. And so she grabs the gate and she starts shaking it, and she's yelling for Kevin, thinking maybe he came in and forgot I was down here and shut and locked the gate. And she's checking over her shoulder, looking down into the basement, and she starts hearing more lights falling off the ceiling and shattering on the ground. She is in absolute panic mode. She's just waiting for someone to come bounding up the stairs towards her. She has no idea what to do. She pulls out her phone and she calls Kevin. Meanwhile, Kevin is making his way back to the antique shop. He's only a couple minutes away, and he sees his phone ringing that was sitting on the passenger seat, and he picks it up, and it's Jane, and he answers, and immediately Jane is hysterical, and she's screaming that someone's in the antique shop that's breaking things, and Kevin's like, slow down, what's going on? And all he can hear in the background is the sound of what sounds like glass shattering and things falling and breaking. And he's like, wait, what's going on? Are you okay, Jane? Like, where are you? And he hears her say, someone's in the basement. And he goes, well, where are you? And she's like, I'm in the basement. And he was like, get out of the basement, call the police. But as he's trying to get her to do that, the phone cuts out. Kevin was only about a block away from the shop, so he floors it to his shop. He parks outside and he's thinking to himself, what am I walking into? Is there going to be like an active burglary going on? Is she going to be held hostage? Like, are the police going to be there? But he just knows he needs to get in there to Jane, and he gets to the front door and it's locked. So he unlocks the front door and he goes inside and it's silent. And he's looking around, there's no damage to the first floor, there's no damage anywhere. And he yells for Jane, there's no answer from Jane. And he starts walking kind of tentatively through the store towards the back. And he gets to that door leading down into the basement, the same one that Jane couldn't open when she ran up the stairs to get out of the basement. And he looks at it, and Jane's not at the top of the stairs anymore. And he's thinking, I didn't lock that door, and I'm the only one with the key to lock that door. How is it locked right now? Does Jane have a key that I don't know about? And why would she lock it? Does that mean Jane's up here somewhere? Is that what happened? And he's like, Jane, come out. Did you lock this door? But Jane's not on the first floor, and their first floor is very small. And so he thinks, okay, she has to be downstairs. And so he opens up the gate, he swings it open, and he starts walking down the steps. And he's really cautious as he's going down because, again, he has no idea what he's walking into. He hits the lights, but the lights don't work down there. And as he starts to bend around the corner where he can actually see into the basement, he sees Jane sitting at the chair right next to that table where that phone is, and she's just sitting there kind of stunned. And he goes to Jane and he's like, what happened down here? And he glances out quickly at all the rows and he sees all this furniture that's come off the shelves, and there's glass all over the ground. And he's looking at Jane, and Jane's just showing no reaction. She's sitting there like she's in shock. And he turns to Jane again and he says, come on, you gotta tell me what happened down here. And Jane just goes, I don't know. I don't know how to explain what happened down here. I was walking down the row, and then I felt like someone was watching me, and then things are falling off the ceiling and the shelves. I've never seen anything like this before. Now at this point, Kevin's adrenaline is through the roof. He came charging in here thinking he was going to have to save Jane from some person breaking in and breaking stuff. But as far as he can tell, there's no one here but Jane. And so he decides he's going to take a flashlight and he's going to explore the basement because either there's someone here or Jane did this. So he grabs his flashlight and he starts walking around, and all he sees is a bunch of broken glass and some furniture that's come off the shelves and a couple other things that are on the ground. But other than that, there's no one down here, and there's no other way to come in or out of here besides the stairs. So after Kevin is certain that no one else is here, he turns to Jane, and he regrets this now. He says in an interview that he feels horrible couldn't move. All she wanted to communicate was to somehow get her son to get rid of that box. She didn't know why, but she felt like the box had something to do with her having the stroke. And so all she could do was move her eyes. And so she found herself, with her son's right here, looking at the Dybbuk box and looking away, looking at the Dybbuk box, looking away, hoping her son would see her eyes as a signal to look at the Dybbuk box and put it together that that thing's bad. And Kevin does realize that his mom is flicking her eyes at the Dybbuk box, but in the moment, he's much more concerned about the health of his mother. And it wasn't until she got put in a hospital and she was being taken care of and he knew she'd be okay, that he remembers, he kind of went over it in his head later that day, that his mom was really scared looking and she was looking at the Dybbuk box like that was the thing that was causing her to be scared. Not the stroke, the Dybbuk box. And Kevin starts thinking to himself, I don't know, there's something off about the Dybbuk box. Either it's really bad luck, or there's some truth to you don't open up this Dybbuk box. Either way, I don't want to take any more chances because so long as I've owned this thing, I've had a horrible thing happen in the basement and now my mom's had a stroke. So I want to get rid of it. So Kevin puts the Dybbuk box at the front of his antique store and he puts it up for sale. And very quickly, a young couple came into the store and they bought the Dybbuk box. And Kevin's relieved. He's like, thank goodness that bad luck charm, that whatever's going on with that thing is gone and out of my life. But just a couple of days later, he was in the back of the shop when he heard the door open and then the door shut. And he walked out expecting to see some customers, but instead he sees the Dybbuk box that's sitting right inside his store. Someone must have just dropped it off. And so he walks up to it and he sees there's a piece of paper that's been taped to the top of the Dybbuk box. And there's writing on it. And all it says is, this has an odd darkness about it. This really freaked Kevin out because in a way, it was like other people were confirming that something was wrong with this box. Kevin did not want the Dybbuk box to be in his store. So he put it in his car and he drove back to his house and he put it in his storage locker and he locked it up and then went back to work for the day. That night when he went home, he went to bed and he had this dream. Where in the dream, he's walking in this courtyard and he's holding the hand of this woman who he believes is his friend, and he trusts this person, and the area he's in feels very friendly, and it's a very positive dream. And as he's walking, all of a sudden, this person starts to pull away from him, and he can't move anymore, and he's losing the grip on this person's hand. And they keep moving and moving until their hand is out of his, and they disappear into the corner of the courtyard where it's totally dark. And so he's looking into the darkness, waiting for his friend to come out again, and he can't move. He's anchored to the spot, and as he's looking, he sees what looks like an old woman walking out of the mist. And her head is down, and he can't tell what she's doing. And she's pretty far away, and she's walking closer and closer to him. And when she's about 5-6 feet away, she raises her head up, and her whole face is falling off. All the skin is falling off of her face. It's rotting. She's like a corpse. And she raises her hands up in front of her. And then she grabs his face and begins pulling off pieces of his face until he suddenly wakes up. Kevin had to compose himself in bed because he was so scared from the dream he just had. He sits up and he goes into the bathroom to get a sip of water, and as he walks past the mirror, he notices there are marks on his shoulders and his arms that he did not have before. It looks like bruising almost. And he's looking at them and he's thinking, no way. That has nothing to do with the dream. This is just coincidence that, she was grabbing me in this area in the dream and now I have marks there. It's just coincidence. And so he kind of writes it off and he goes back to bed. And he has the same dream. He gets up again and he's breathing heavily, he's sweating because he just had the same dream. It was this terrifying dream, and he goes back into the bathroom and now his entire back is covered in bruises. He has bruises all over his back, all over his arms. He's got red marks on his neck, and now in his mind he feels like it has to do with the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is now in my backyard. It's not a coincidence that all of a sudden I'm having these horrific dreams that are apparently manifesting themselves in bruises and marks on my actual body. And so Kevin is done with the Dybbuk box, and instead of going back to bed, he goes to his computer and he puts the Dybbuk box on eBay up for sale. And that night, 2 college kids named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, they buy the Dybbuk box, and Kevin could not be happier to package that thing up and ship it off. Sam and Brian had seen the ad on eBay for the Dybbuk box, and at first it did not seem remarkable, but they saw that Kevin had given this really detailed description of all the strange things that had happened for him since he owned the Dybbuk box. And I think clearly Kevin's angle was he was almost trying to advertise it to groups of people that might be interested in that. And Sam and Brian were exactly that demographic because they were looking for things online that were considered haunted. They wanted to see if ghosts and the paranormal were real, and so they were eager to buy the Dybbuk box and test it out. And so 3 weeks later, when this package finally arrives in Missouri at their house, Brian was still out at class, but Sam was home, so he receives the package He eagerly brings it into the kitchen, he unpackages it, and he sets it on the kitchen table. And just a few minutes later, Brian comes home, and Brian would say in interviews that when he walked in, it smelled like someone had peed all over the apartment, like there was urine everywhere. And he's walking around thinking, what happened? It smells so bad in here. And he walks into the kitchen where it was the strongest smell, and there's Sam proudly standing next to this awful looking chest, which was of course the Dybbuk box. And he realizes, Brian does, that the Dybbuk box is what smells like urine. And he goes, Sam, do you smell that? And Sam's like, yeah, that's the smell of ghosts. Sam would pick it up and go, ooh, to Brian as soon as he walked into the kitchen. And Sam joked about how he couldn't wait to sleep in the same bed as the Dybbuk box. They were just making a big joke out of it. Sam had also set up a blog where he was going to document everything that happened from day one of receiving this Dybbuk box to whenever they got rid of it, or till whenever something happened. And for the first 2 weeks they had the Dybbuk box in their possession, nothing did happen. But when Sam started bringing the Dybbuk box out and leaving it right in the middle of these huge parties they would throw, where people were spilling beer on it and they were opening it up and putting things inside of it and making jokes with it, when they were doing that to the Dybbuk box, suddenly they started seeing a pretty significant uptick in strangeness inside of their house. It started with their technology. Sam's laptop crashed and the hard drive was unrecoverable, so he had to replace his laptop. All of their watches just didn't work while they were in the house. No matter what they did, no matter when they fixed it, the watch just simply did not work. Their Xbox would not turn on, but when they brought it to another person's house, it worked just fine. It just couldn't work inside of their house. And the toaster, anytime you turned it on, it basically immediately incinerated whatever you put inside of it. But none of these technological difficulties were frightening to Sam or Brian. They were just frustrating. And I don't even think they were connecting them with the Dybbuk box. It was just this thing that was happening to them. It wasn't until the light bulbs in their house started bursting in the middle of the night that they started to get pretty creeped out about some of the things that were happening in their apartment. That now all of a sudden it did seem like, maybe if the Dybbuk box really is cursed, this might be how it would manifest. And so they'd replace the light bulb, and then sure enough it would burst again. And they couldn't keep light bulbs in because they kept popping, and so their house was dark a lot of the time. But the worst part was when they had this massive insect infestation inside of their apartment. And they were really localized around the Dybbuk box. All these insects would come out of the walls, out of the toilets, out of the sink. They'd come from behind the fridge, and they would all kind of like converge on the Dybbuk box and go inside of it. The Dybbuk box at one point was swarming with insects all over, and they had to shut the door. They couldn't even go in the room with the Dybbuk box because it was just covered in insects. But despite how scary this was for the boys, they had become kind of like a cool talking point on campus because of Sam's blog that a lot of other students were following. And so the boys kind of liked the clout they got with that, and they decided they didn't want to get rid of the box after all. But it wasn't long after the insect infestation that Sam began losing all of his hair, and at the same time, he started having this constant hallucination that there was an old woman in his peripheral vision on either side of his head pretty much at all times. Anywhere he went, there basically was someone he couldn't quite see following him around. Whether he was well rested, whether he was totally exhausted, it didn't matter. He always saw this shrouded dark figure that he believed was an old woman, and it scared him so much he couldn't sleep until he began going into Brian's room and sitting on Brian's bed because it was the one place he felt a little bit of comfort. And as he's sitting on the bed, he would see these dark figures standing on either side of him all night. And so finally, no matter how cool their blog was, it became too much, and they decided we have to get rid of the Dybbuk box. And so they put it on eBay, and very quickly it gets sold to a guy named Jason, who is this museum director over at this other university in Missouri, and he had actually been following along with Sam's blog. He was very interested in what was going on with the Dybbuk box, and when it was listed for sale, he was all over it. He wanted to buy it. So the boys eagerly ship off the Dybbuk box, and Jason receives it in the middle of a workday. So he puts the package in his truck, and he goes upstairs and he works for the day, and then afterwards, when everyone's left the office, he goes downstairs, gets the package, brings it back up to his office, puts it on his desk, and he cuts open the packaging. Jason decided he wanted to evaluate the Dybbuk box the way he would evaluate any other antique or item that was coming into the museum that he was the director of. And so Jason starts by taking a whole bunch of pictures all around the outside of the Dybbuk box, and then he gets his blacklight out and he begins scanning around the outside, and he finds all these traces of wax all over the outside, which leads him to believe this was probably used in some sort of ritual. And then he takes a deep breath and he sits down right in front of the Dybbuk box, and he pops off the lock, He gets ready, and he opens the doors, and the drawer slides out with that whole mechanical device. It all kind of comes open, and Jason's totally let down because nothing happens. And part of him thought, like, if this thing is haunted, as soon as you open it up, the haunting's going to begin. And nothing happened. And he's pretty let down about it. And so ultimately, after staring at it and looking at the pennies that are in there and the Shalom statue and the locks of hair, he's just kind of let down by it, and he decides, okay, I kind of got my hopes up for something. This was clearly a hoax. There's nothing going on here. It's just a random old chest. And so he closes it up, and he puts it on another desk that wasn't the one that he worked at, but was just kind of another table inside of this office that he shared with some other people. And he figured it would be a good talking point to tell his colleagues about, and it would be kind of like a showpiece. So the next day, his colleagues come in, and he explains what a Dybbuk box is, and the history around it, that it's supposed to be haunted, and it makes people sick, and gives people strokes, and there's been insects that have been known to come out of it and go into it. It's this very creepy thing, and his colleagues are like, wow, that's pretty cool, but they don't think much of it until all of the electronics inside of their office start to fail. Namely, their computers start crashing, and their IT department comes up, and they're like, we don't know why this is happening, but sorry, we can't recover it. And the light bulbs kept going out to the point where they went out and got this huge pack of extra light bulbs to replace the light bulbs as they went out. Something they never had to do before, but all of a sudden the Dybbuk box is in the room and the light bulbs are going out left and right. And then finally, Jason's co-workers that share that space with the Dybbuk box, they all got sick, and they blamed the Dybbuk box. They said, you know what? We were fine until that thing came in here. Now all of a sudden our computers don't work, the lights don't work, and we're getting sick. Get rid of it, Jason. So that day after work, Jason goes and takes the Dybbuk box, puts it in the back of his truck, and his truck had a cover on the back. So he secures it in the back, he drives home, and he doesn't want to bring it inside because it just seemed weird to bring a cursed object inside that his coworkers just made him get out of their space because it was making him sick and it was ruining their things. So he thinks, okay, I'll leave it in my truck overnight and I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it tomorrow. He goes inside, he says hi to his family, and before long it's time for bed and Jason goes to sleep. In order to understand what happened to Jason, you need to understand the layout of his house. When you open the front door, you walk inside, and there's a wall on your right-hand side. That's the side of the house. And you walk forward about 5 or 6 feet, and on your left is a staircase that goes up to the second floor. You walk up that staircase, straight ahead of you is going to be a bathroom. If you go left and walk down the hall another 5 or 6 feet, you come to the master suite where Jason and his wife would sleep. If you walk through that door, there is a wall on your left where there's a big bay window that looks out onto the street. And there's a big street light that sits right outside that projects very orangey yellow light into their room at night. You know, they have a shade up. It's just orange glow that comes through this window right here on this side. And then on the other side of the room is the bed. And the bed is situated where the feet are pointed towards this window over here, and the head of the bed is against this wall. And it's centered on this wall here. And Jason, if you were looking overhead at the top of this bed, Jason's on the left side, but he's the farthest into his room, and his wife is the closest into the room. So that night, Jason goes to bed and he falls asleep. But just a couple hours later, he wakes up suddenly and he can't move his body. He can only move his eyes. He's laying on his back, and the light from the street light is very strong. It's this orangey glow in their whole room. And he's laying there trying to move his hands and his legs, but he can't do it. And as he's doing that, he starts hearing footsteps out on the stairs. And they're distinctive sounds. Slow, plodding steps all the way up to the second floor. And Jason's laying here with his eyes looking towards the door because his door is open and he can barely see into the second floor landing. And he's waiting to see who came up the stairs. And his heart's racing and he's looking, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees what looks like a dark figure begin to walk into the room. And his heart starts racing even faster when he can tell it's definitely not someone he knows. It's this woman, this older woman with a shawl over her head, and her head is tucked down so he can't see her. And this is all out of the corner of his eye, and because of the orange hue coming in from the window, he can definitely tell that there is a real solid figure right there. This is not in his imagination, it's right there. And this woman begins shuffling her way across the foot of the bed, and right at the foot of the bed, as Jason's looking at her, she turns and looks directly at him. And then she runs around the corner and she looks down at him and she takes her fingers and she drives them into his eyes. And Jason thinks it's real and he's screaming in pain, and he wakes up and his wife is grabbing him and she's like, Jason, what's wrong? And he's like, what's going on? And she says, honey, it's just a bad dream. You're fine. And he's shaken up. You know, his heart's still racing from this dream he's just had. And he's trying to think, like, that felt really real. And he's like feeling his eyes. And he can't believe that that was a dream. That was the most vivid dream he's ever had in his life. And so eventually he goes back to sleep, and the next morning when he gets up, he goes in the bathroom and he looks at his eyes, and they're all red around the outside, and the whites of his eyes are covered in blood. His eyes look horrible, like he's having this terrible allergic reaction to something, or it looks like someone might have punched him in the eyes, or maybe gouged his eyes. That's how it looks. And his wife comes in and she's like, "What happened to me?" And he's like, "Oh my God, I have no idea." It was around this time that Jason began to think the Dybbuk box might just be cursed, because the two previous owners have said in their disclosures on eBay that horrible, vivid dreams, just like the one he had, to include physical manifestations, are part of having this Dybbuk box. Jason considered just dumping this thing in a dumpster somewhere, but then he was concerned that he might be passing on this Dybbuk box to someone who wasn't ready for it. And so he decided he would give it another day and he would do some research about how to properly dispose of the Dybbuk box. And so that night when Jason came back from work, he left the Dybbuk box in his truck covered up in his driveway. And so Jason goes inside, he has dinner with his family, and then he's sitting down in the TV room and he's watching TV with his son. And as they're watching TV quietly, Jason hears his son say, "Hey Dad, who is that?" And he looks over at his son, and his son is pointing behind him. And Jason turns around, and standing right behind him is the same woman who had come in his room with a shawl on, that gouged his eyes out in his dream, and then she suddenly disappears. And Jason's looking at his son like, "You just saw that too?" And he's like, "Yeah, who was that?" And so Jason grabs his son, he yells for his wife and says, "We have to leave the house right now." His wife comes downstairs and she's like, "What's going on?" And he was like, "I will explain in the car, and we have to take your car." And so his wife sees how serious Jason is, and she says, "Okay," and they get into her car and they drive down the road. And that's when Jason explains what's going on with the Dybbuk box, and how he and his son just saw the same woman that he had seen in his dream the night before, that gouged his eyes, and his eyes were red, and his wife's starting to get really scared, and his son's really scared of what's going on. And so the solution they came up with was they were going to drive back to their house, drop Jason off, who was going to get in his truck where the Dybbuk box is still in the back, it's still locked in the back of the truck. He's going to drive it a few miles outside of town to a rental property they own that no one was staying in, and he was going to put it in the basement. And it was going to stay there until they figured out how to dispose of it, because they didn't like the idea of just dumping it somewhere, because they felt like if this is real and it's actually this cursed Dybbuk box, then somebody else is going to be cursed by this Dybbuk box unless we find a way, or at least attempt to find a way to contain it and destroy it. And so Jason gets dropped off, he gets in his truck, he drives to the rental property, he puts it in the basement, he seals it up, and he goes back to his house. Once Jason got back to his house, his wife and his son came back as well. And that night, Jason would go on eBay and he would find the contact information for Kevin, the original owner of the Dybbuk box, after the estate sale. And he called him that night, and Kevin actually picked up, and the two of them spoke, and Kevin ultimately agrees to help Jason find a way to properly dispose of this Dybbuk box. And what Kevin offers to do is drive back to the house where he had originally purchased this Dybbuk box and see if he can get some more information about what it is and what they do with it. The next day, Kevin, the antique shop owner, he goes back to the house where he originally bought the Dybbuk box at the estate sale. He knocks on the door, and an old woman comes to the door, and Kevin introduces himself, and he says, "Hey, I was here not too long ago, and I purchased lot 29 that included that Dybbuk box, and I wanted to know some more information about it." And the woman reacted, and she's like, "I told my family not to sell that. I know what was inside of it, and I know you're not supposed to open it, and I tried to tell my family, and they didn't listen. I really hope you didn't open it." And Kevin's like, "Actually, yeah, I did open it," and he described all the horrible things that happened, and he described selling it, and all the subsequent owners, how they've had all these issues, and how they've arrived at this place now where Jason in Missouri is having all these issues, and they're trying to find a way to dispose of it. And that's when Sophie describes what's actually inside of this box. Sophie said she lived in Poland before World War II with her cousin Havila, who was the woman who had passed away, and all her things were being sold at the estate sale. And she said that at the time, it was all the rage to have seances and try to talk to dead people and spirits, and they would just do it for fun. Sophie, Havila, and their mother, they would do this for fun. And Havila had made this Ouija board where she'd stitched letters onto this blanket, and they put it over this table, and they would all hold this pendant that was suspended by a chain, and they would ask questions, and they would hope that, a spirit that they were interacting with would interact with this chain, and it would swivel around the pendant, and it would point to the different letters whenever they asked a question, and it would spell out, whatever their answer was. And Sophie said nothing ever happened. It was just kind of a fun thing for them to do. But one time it did work. And they said the chain would go rigid and it would point over and over and it would spell the words, "Release me, release me, release me." Sophie said the women were incredulous and didn't believe it at first. But then they started to worry that if they didn't help this thing, that if it were a Dybbuk and were a malevolent spirit, it would find a way to attach itself to one of them. And so Sophie said they devised this ritual where they released it, but into this wine box that they were able to shut and lock. And that wine box became the Dybbuk box. And that Dybbuk box is the same one that was sold to Kevin. Kevin told Sophie that, "What do? We've already opened it up." And she said, "You need to contact a rabbi." And so they would call a rabbi, and apparently they were able to reclaim the Dybbuk inside of the box and lock it and put it away in a secret location where it's been since 2003. And apparently since it's been sealed off, Jason and Kevin have said they've experienced no demonic activity, and they never plan to tell anybody where this thing is because they don't want anyone else to have even the opportunity to reopen the Dybbuk box and have to deal with all the horrible things that they went through. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's video, please tell us in the comments section and tell us where you found it. So what's the timestamp? And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, at the next solar eclipse, please give the like button a pair of cardboard flimsy children's 3D glasses and tell them with these on, you can look directly at the solar eclipse and be totally safe. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It is linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Before you skip today's video, just watch the top story. It's called Turn Around. Watch it start to finish so you can see the ending. And then once you've seen the ending, watch it again. It is so creepy when you know what was actually going on the whole time they were there. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to spot the like button on their next set of bench press, and then as soon as they start to fatigue, walk away. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In the early 2000s, a teenager named Evan and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Evan turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Evan and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Evan and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked hear that?" And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction, and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and carefully explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier, and Eben's father turns to Eben and says, "Before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys." After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening because they're hoping this is just going to stop and whatever this is just going to leave. But it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest, and it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them. And then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge.
What you'll learn from Doublelift is what it takes to be an amazing AD carry.
Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to reveal the picture or pictures that are famously associated with them. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button breakfast, but instead of powdered sugar, use baby powder on their French toast. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In early August 1945, warfare changed forever when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. These bombs would devastate the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 100,000 people. America's goals in dropping these 2 bombs was to hasten Japan's surrender and end World War II, as well as avoid any further Allied casualties. But America also wanted to showcase to the world, really the Soviet Union, that it had this new, extremely destructive technology at their disposal. So on August 6, 1945 at 8:15, every year hundreds of people go missing inside of national parks and forests all over North America. Of those hundreds, there's always a few that baffle investigators because either they go missing under very strange circumstances, like they were right in front of someone they were.
What you'll learn from Doublelift is
every year, hundreds of people go missing inside of national parks and forests all over North America. Of those hundreds, there's always a few that baffle investigators because either they go missing under very strange circumstances, like they were right in front of someone, they were talking to someone, and then, in a second they're gone, or where they're discovered doesn't make any sense, that they've covered a distance that is too far for them to have covered, or they're in locations that are just physically impossible to get to. One man is making it his mission to research these very strange disappearances. His name is David Paulides. He's a former police detective. He covers all of these cases in his book series called Missing 411. I went out and bought all of them. They're incredible. He has a YouTube channel called the Can-Am Missing Project. That's linked below in the description. And so today I'm going to share 3 missing person cases that have all been covered by David Paulides in Missing 411. And hopefully by the end of this video, you're just as interested in the Missing 411 phenomenon that David Paulides has brought to light. And hopefully you'll go over to his channel, the Can-Am Missing Project, and you'll give them a follow because he has poured tens of thousands of hours into this. Without David Paulides, there would be no Missing 411 project, and many people that go missing would just be forgotten about. So shout out to David Paulides for keeping their memories alive and keeping the public engaged in something that is truly baffling and needs more attention. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. If that's of interest to you, then please sneak into the like button's house and replace all of their salt shakers with sugar. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. So just a couple of weeks ago, early on July 24th, 2020, an 18-year-old woman named Gia Fuda who was living with her parents in Seattle, Washington, wakes up in their home, goes downstairs, says good morning to her mother and to her father. She has a sip of a seltzer water, and then she heads out to her car and says, okay, I'll see you tonight, and she drives off. Gia's mother said that because of the quarantine, all of Gia's college classes had been moved online, and Gia didn't like doing all of her work in the house. She felt trapped. And so her routine consisted of getting up early and heading to Bellevue College, which is just outside of Seattle, where she could do some work in their library, do her online courses there, and then come back sometime in the evening. And so Gia's parents assumed that's what she was doing that day. But when Gia left that morning, she did not follow her typical COVID-19 routine of going to Bellevue College to do schoolwork. Instead, she hopped on the highway and she drove 60 miles to a very rural part of Washington State. It's very heavily forested. It's called Index, Washington. And she gets picked up on a camera inside of a coffee shop where she gets a cup of coffee and she buys a Bigfoot keychain and then gets back in her car and drives another 30 miles away from Seattle, away from her parents' home. It's unclear where she's going until her car runs out of gas. And when she ran out of gas, it was like she wasn't prepared for it because she was only able to turn her car and barely pull off of Highway 2. It didn't look like she'd intentionally parked. And it's actually how investigators spotted it because it was jutting out into the road slightly. She gets out, and instead of walking on the highway to try to get help or trying to flag down another motorist, she grabs her cell phone, her Bible, and a journal and turns and starts walking directly uphill. There's like this mountain right next to the highway, and it's very densely forested. And she just starts walking straight up this mountain. It's important to note that David Paulides just recently came out with a video about this case on his Can-Am Missing Project channel. And he says that the area she stopped in is an area where at least a dozen other people have gone missing under baffling circumstances that have all been covered in the Missing 411 phenomenon. By 11:30 that night, Gia's parents were starting to get very concerned that they hadn't heard from their daughter and that she hadn't come home yet. They started texting her and calling her, no answer, no response. By 1 a.m., they called the police. So this huge search is launched to go find Gia. Hundreds of volunteers, they have all these professional search and rescue people out there, they have helicopters overhead, and almost immediately, within a few hours of the search being launched, they find her car on Highway 2. But no sign of her anywhere. The area that she was in was actually a dead zone for cell phone service, so they couldn't get in touch with her in part because they had no service, and authorities weren't able to track her phone because there was no cell phone reception. So they didn't have much to work with except that they generally knew where she might be, which is in this very thick section of the Cascade Mountains. And so for days and days, they're searching and turning up nothing. And unfortunately, as time ticks on, the likelihood of her being found alive is next to zero. But 7 days into this huge search where nothing has been turned up, they have this huge find. A couple of the searchers that were miles away from where she had gone missing. I mean, at this point, you're 7 days into the search. You have searchers combing miles and miles of territory, and there's nothing. They've found nothing. And these searchers are up near this scenic creek where there's a little bit of a clearing, there's this creek, and they find in one area her jacket, her shoes, her phone, her journal, and her Bible, all in one area. It looked like she had just suddenly stripped everything she had, put it on the ground, but she was nowhere to be found. So while this find is certainly great progress towards discovering what happened, it unfortunately sent a message to her parents that at this point, you need to brace for the worst, because now your daughter is not only missing and has been for a week, she doesn't have any gear. She has no clothes, she has no phone, she's just gone and has nothing. So the omen was very bad at this point. But her family and the searchers were not willing to give up, so they continued to search this new area where all of her stuff had been found for another 2 days. And on the 9th day from when she had gone missing, they found her, and she was alive. She was sitting on a rock near this creek. When they approached her, she was very startled to see people coming near her. She clearly was not expecting to be found. She was also more or less incoherent. She believed she had only been out for maybe 3 days and just had gotten lost, but they told her she had been gone for 9 days. But she was unhurt. She had a couple scratches on her. She was definitely emaciated, but she had been drinking from the stream and eating huckleberries, so she was, taking care of herself, but she was totally confused. She didn't know why she was there. And when she was pressed a little bit further, she didn't know why she drove where she drove. She doesn't know why she walked up a very steep mountain into the Cascades. She also has no idea what happened over the first 6-7 days. She only recalled the last couple and thought that's the whole time she had been out there. So it's a very confusing story, and one that probably we will never get a clear answer to. This will just become another one of the thousands of very odd disappearances that occur all over North America, except at least in this case she was found alive.
Little Rue. None of them ever had a chance.
Tom Mezek was this salty Army veteran. He had served in the 82nd Airborne Division, which is an elite paratrooper division. He taught survival training classes, but more than anything, he loved to hunt. And he actually hunted in this one particular area in New York all the time with the same group of friends. In fact, for like 55 years, Tom and his 6 hunter friends would hunt this one area. On November 15th, 2015, Tom and his hunting buddies decide to go hunt in this area. And they got a bit of a late start. They didn't get out there till about noon. So they decided, in order to make up for lost time, to use this technique that's referred to as a deer drive, where you have stationary watchers that set up on a line about 100 meters apart from one another, and you have a group of drivers that kind of corral any deer or any animals in the area and push them so that they go past the watchers who can take a shot at those animals. And so Tom, along with 3 other hunters, were made watchers, and they set up along this hillside where Tom was all the way on the left flank, which meant on his left were no hunters. He did have a hunter 100 meters to his right, and then there was 2 other hunters all the way up the hill on the right as well, but he was on the outer flank of that line. And the 3 other hunters that were going to be doing the driving were to his right as well. Behind this hill, they were going to try to push the deer up and over this hill down to this line of watchers. After 3 hours and no luck, they haven't seen one deer, they start to also comment on the fact that there doesn't seem to be any wildlife at all. No squirrels, no birds, no anything. There's just silence, which is very odd for this area. And when you consider that this group has hunted this area for 55 years, they have a really good understanding of what normal looks like. And before anything happened back out, they're yelling for Tom. They're wondering, did he fall down? They're like, okay, let's radio him, because everybody had radios. There's no answer from Tom. They're searching the area where he was. They start shooting their rifles into the air. They can't find him, and they think, okay, well, we don't know what he's doing, but this guy is super competent. He was healthy. Let's just go to the cars and wait for him. And so they're sitting at the parking lot, which is not very far from where they were hunting. And this is an area they always parked in, and this is an area they always hunted in. So they knew that Tom knows where they're going to be. And so they sat there waiting, and he's just not showing up. So eventually, the hunters call it in to the rangers that he's gone missing. A massive search is launched for Tom. I mean, they are combing this area. They got helicopters, professional search teams. They're looking in lakes, they're looking under logs, they're looking everywhere, and there's not a shred of evidence of Tom. They can't find his walkie-talkie, they can't find his gun, there's no clothes, there's nothing. He's just disappeared. On the 4th day of the search, the FBI shows up, and they get involved in the search, which didn't make any sense, because why is the FBI getting involved 4 days into a search for an elderly hunter where there's no sign of foul play? Why are they getting involved? It didn't really add up. And all they would tell Tom's wife is that they believed that something was off about this case, and that's why they were there. But they couldn't elaborate unless more information came in. But nothing ever shows up. Even though Tom was a bit older, he literally taught survival classes. He was the guy teaching other people how to survive in the woods. He also has been hunting in that particular area for 55 years. How is it that he in no way was able to signal that something was wrong, and that all these people, including the FBI, can't find any trace of him? It just seems like something is off. I gotta agree with the FBI on this one. In 2013, 51-year-old Dale Stelling decided to take a trip from Texas, where he lived with his wife and his parents, up to Colorado. He was an avid outdoorsman, and he had always wanted to go hiking and camping in Colorado. So he, his wife, and his parents load up the RV, and they start making their way up to Colorado. On June 9th, as they're making their way to Colorado, their RV breaks down in New Mexico. Even though they were eager to get to Colorado, Dale saw that where they had broken down was near the Mesa Verde National Park, and he thought, well, we weren't planning this, but let's just stay here for a night and go check out the park tomorrow. Then we'll get the RV fixed and we'll be on our way to Colorado. And so they all agree. They stay the night, and the next morning they head over to Mesa Verde National Park. It was a very hot day that day, and Dale's wife was overweight and not very healthy, and his parents were very elderly. So when they got to the park, they ended up just sitting at the visitor center, and no one really wanted to actually go walk around. But Dale was an avid hiker, and he didn't like the idea of just sitting around all day. And so at some point, Dale just says, hey, I'm gonna go stretch my legs and walk this trail here down to the abandoned city ruins. There was this city that had been built into the cliff that lots of tourists would go check out. And so his wife and his parents, they don't bat an eye. They say, okay, we'll see you in a little bit. And Dale was off. Dale made it seem like it was going to be a very quick trip. And so when he didn't return in 2 hours, his family decided to tell rangers and say, hey, you know, our husband, our son, he went hiking down that trail there towards the ruins, and we haven't heard from him. We can't get in touch with him on the phone. You know, can you guys go look for him? The rangers actually were not concerned at all. They said that we've never had anybody go missing for more than a few hours here. It's pretty hard to get lost. You know, there's lots of tourists here, well-marked trails. Just give it a couple more hours, and if he doesn't show up, then we'll go out and look for him. But after about an hour, and they still hadn't seen him, his family really pressed the issue with the rangers, and they would go looking for Dale. And of course, they can't find him. But they found a number of tourists that had seen him on the trail that he said he was going to be on. They had even talked to him. He was a very energetic, charismatic guy, and they would say that he seemed like he was just another tourist enjoying his time at the park. There's nothing odd about his behavior at all. And he was walking towards the area where he had told his family he was going. While that information was certainly useful, they still couldn't find Dale. And they were really fighting against the elements on this one. You know, the temperatures were over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and had been all day, and Dale didn't have any water. So they really had a limited amount of time to find him. So within 24 hours, there's this huge search that's launched for Dale. And interestingly, in the first 24 hours of this search, a woman was at the park and was walking along the trail that Dale was on. And she remembers hearing a weak male voice yelling for help. And so she kind of looked over the edge. She couldn't see down below her. She was on a bit of a cliff. Fearing that if she went to look, she might fall and become a victim, she went back to the rangers and said, hey, here's the area I was in. I heard someone yelling for help. You should go check it out. And the rangers said that actually we've been getting that report. We got that report yesterday. But when we went to look in that area, we can't find anything. There's no one over there. So while it seems very likely that that person calling for help was most likely Dale, we don't know for sure because they were never able to locate who was asking for help. And to this day, we have no idea where Dale is. There's been no shred of evidence to indicate where he went. He just vanished. If you enjoyed today's story, if you haven't already, please sneak into the like button's house and replace all of their salt shakers with sugar. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. So I'd love to get your reaction to these 3 stories. What do you think happened and why? And I'll do my best to get back to as many of you as I possibly can. If you're interested in learning more about the missing 411 phenomenon as documented by David Paulides, then you should check out David Paulides and his team at their YouTube channel, the Can-Am Missing Project. I've also provided links in the description below to all of their work. Also, I have a Missing 411 playlist that you can save and watch that as well. If you have a story suggestion for me to use on this channel, go to our subreddit, which is just Mr. Ballin. It's linked below. It's a place where you can drop your story suggestions. And if I intentionally use your suggestion, I will absolutely credit you. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My username is JohnBallin416. Also, I'm very active on TikTok, where my handle is Mr. Ballin. So whether I see you on Reddit, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, some combination, just know I'm incredibly thankful for your support. And until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to share 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will reveal the picture or pictures that are famously associated with that story. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please RSVP as single to the like button's wedding and then show up with a +1. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories. Soon after the Beatles dissolved in 1969, one of the 4 members, John Lennon, left his native England and moved to New York City. Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, took up residence in the Dakota, which is a very famous building that typically houses the rich and famous people of New York. As soon as Lennon moved to New York, he said that he felt relieved because he didn't have to worry about going outside and getting mobbed by a massive crowd of people that were obsessed with the Beatles. There were people that were huge Beatles fans in New York, but they seemed more respectful, and they would ask for his autograph, but they would mostly leave him alone. Mark David Chapman had always been a massive fan of the Beatles with a particular interest in John Lennon. But after a 1966 interview where John Lennon kind of off the cuff said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, this soured Chapman's adoration of Lennon. One of Chapman's high school friends recalls around this time frame Chapman rewriting the song Imagine by John Lennon to read, "Imagine if John Lennon was dead." Chapman started referring to Lennon as a poser and said that he espoused virtues and ideals that he himself did not practice. And so in relative short order, following that 1966 interview, Chapman went from this adoring fan of the Beatles and John Lennon to really solely hating John Lennon and everything he stood for. By 1980, it's safe to say Mark Chapman had become obsessed with John Lennon. Specifically, he had become obsessed with hating John Lennon. In October of 1980, Chapman quits his job as a security guard and flies to New York City. For 2 months, he stayed in the city and didn't really do much of anything. He would just periodically walk past the Dakota where John Lennon supposedly was living, but beyond that, he really didn't do anything in the city. But that would all change on December 8th, 1980. On that day, Chapman went to the Dakota, and he stood right outside the entrance to this building and just waited in hopes that he might run into John Lennon. At 5 p.m. that day, John Lennon comes out with his wife Yoko Ono, and they walk right past Mark Chapman, who flags them down, and he asks John if he can have his autograph. And John Lennon, even though he has a limousine waiting for him, and there's people that are starting to notice that, oh, that's John Lennon, people are coming over, John still took the time to sign an autograph for Mark Chapman. He was very friendly with Mark and asked him if this is enough, do you want anything else? And Mark said, no, that's it, that's fine. And John Lennon said, okay, take care. And John and his wife Yoko Ono turned and went into the limousine and they drove away. When the couple got back to the Dakota that night, Mark Chapman had not left. John Lennon and Yoko Ono get out of their vehicle and they walk past Mark Chapman, who's standing right outside the front door. It's unclear if Mark and John had any interaction, but as soon as they passed Mark and were making their way into the building, Mark Chapman drew a gun and shot John Lennon 4 times in the back. And John Lennon staggers into the lobby screaming, I'm shot, before collapsing and dying. And Mark Chapman, he knew what he was doing. He just stood there, put the gun back in his pocket, and just waited to be arrested. Chapman's lawyers wanted him to plead insanity, but he refused and instead said, I was totally sane, I knew what I was doing, I chose to shoot John Lennon, and I plead guilty. And he was given 20 years to life in jail. And while he was in jail, he would admit that the only reason he did that was to become famous. That was it. This is the picture of Mark Chapman getting that autograph from John Lennon in front of the Dakota just hours before he would gun him down. He's still in jail today, and he actually just had his 11th parole hearing last month in August of 2020, and it was denied. On July 17, 2014, people at Amsterdam's bustling international airport began boarding Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 that was bound for Kuala Lumpur. The 283 passengers on board were from all over the world. Some were traveling for vacation, some were going home, others were just traveling for business. In addition to the 283 passengers, there were also 15 crew members that rounded out the flight to a total of 298 people on board MH17. One of the passengers, before walking down the runway to get on the flight, took a picture of the plane itself and uploaded it to Facebook and kind of jokingly captioned it, If we go missing, this is what it looks like, in reference to another Malaysian Airlines flight, Flight 370, that had actually gone missing just a couple of months earlier. Once the boarding was complete on MH17, one of the passengers on board uploaded to Instagram a short video of passengers stuffing their luggage into bins and the captain coming over the intercom saying that, boarding is complete and it's time to turn off your cell phones as we prepare for takeoff. A 15-year-old Dutch boy named Gary Slock and his mother Petra had just sat down inside the plane and they could barely contain their excitement. The pair had signed up for what they were calling a vacation of a lifetime with a group that took single parents and their children on these lavish vacations. Gary, who was the goalkeeper for a soccer team, had been telling his family how jealous his teammates were of this trip he was about to go on with his mother. Before Gary turned off his phone, as instructed by the captain, he took a selfie of he and his mom grinning ear to ear, excited about their trip, and he uploaded it to Facebook for his friends and family to see. Gary turns off his cell phone, puts it away, and he and his mom sit back and get ready for takeoff. The plane takes off without a hitch. It gets up to cruising altitude, and it's going to be a long flight. It's about 12 hours from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, and so everybody on board's kind of settling in. They're getting their iPads out, they're getting a book out maybe. The crew is making their rounds, offering snacks and drinks, and people are looking out the window. It's a beautiful day, and everyone's just kind of settling in for a long flight. About 3 hours after takeoff, around 4 p.m., the captain of MH17 got in touch with air traffic control at the nearby airport, which was in Ukraine. The pilot told controllers that everything was fine. He was flight level, 33,000 feet. The controllers acknowledged that and said, hey, there's a little bit of air traffic in the direction you're going. You need to reroute your course very slightly. The pilot acknowledged this change in course and was beginning to tell them what he was going to do next when he cut out. The controllers on the ground in Ukraine began hailing MH17 to try to get the captain back online. They couldn't reach him. The plane had sent no distress signals, and over the course of their communication, the controllers had not noticed anything abnormal. And so this sudden radio silence really didn't make any sense. Yelena Brichenko was a 20-year-old bank teller living in Ukraine who happened to be looking up right as MH17 was flying overhead. She would later say that what she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she was watching, MH17 just explodes, and the people inside of the plane very clearly get ejected out of the plane. And she's watching as these people and bits of plane are falling from 33,000 feet, and they come crashing down in this huge fiery inferno. The theory, backed by US intelligence, was that pro-Russian separatists could have fired a missile at this plane thinking it was Ukrainian military. It was not. It was just civilians. All 298 people on board MH17 perished, including Gary and Petra. This is the selfie that Gary took moments before takeoff with his mother as they were excited about their vacation. Family and friends that saw this picture on Facebook would say that this image perfectly captures Gary's wonderful personality and the love that Gary and Petra had for each other. From the outside, Bart Whitaker appeared to love his family. He and his younger brother Kevin were extremely close, and Bart and his father shared a passion for long-distance cycling and would often go out and bike around the neighborhood together. Bart's family would regularly go on vacation to places like Cancun, and the pictures of Bart with his family on these vacations are always him beaming with happiness and love for his family. On December 10th, 2003, Bart, who was 23, almost 24 years old at the time, made a special announcement to his family. He told his family that he had just finished taking his final exams of his senior year at nearby Sam Houston State College and that he was going to graduate. Bart was not a natural student and frankly struggled in college, and so this was a really big announcement, and the family was really excited for him, especially his parents. And so they said, we have to go out and celebrate. And so they went out to a restaurant, they're having this really expensive, lavish dinner, and in fact his parents had bought a really nice Rolex watch to give to Bart if he were to graduate college. And so here he is announcing it, and they thought, you know what, now's a good time to give it to him. They give him his Rolex, and they're asking people at nearby tables to take their pictures, and everybody just seems so happy, and the parents are so proud of Bart. After they finish dinner, they're all smiles, they pile back in the family car, and they start making their drive back to Sugar Land, Texas, where the Whitaker residence was. It was inside of this upper-class suburb about 40 minutes away from Houston, Texas. On the drive home, his parents are endlessly talking about how proud they are of Bart and how excited they are for his future. They get back to their house, they pull in the driveway, and Bart's brother and parents make their way up to the front door. Bart is behind them and he says, "Hey, I forgot something in the car." He turns around and goes back to the car as his brother and his parents walk into the house and are immediately gunned down by an assassin waiting inside of the Whitaker residence. Bart hears the shooting and runs back inside the house. He sees his family is down. He ends up wrestling with the shooter, who ends up shooting him but hits him in the arm before escaping the house. A neighbor hears the shooting and runs outside and sees this chaotic scene. They call 911. Police show up and Bart's brother, Kevin, has passed away, as well as his mother. They both died on scene. As for Bart and Bart's father, they would go to the hospital and they would both make a full recovery. So this huge investigation is launched to figure out who this assassin was and why he was attacking the Whitaker family. And quickly they discovered that Bart Whitaker had hired him. Bart Whitaker wanted his family killed so he could take their money. And he had the assassin shoot him in the arm to make it look like, this was not his fault and he wasn't involved. Here's a picture from the night they were out celebrating Bart's big accomplishment that he had finished his final exams, except Bart was a total liar and he had stopped going to classes ages ago. He was failing every class and was not even close to graduating. In this picture, Bart knows that the assassin he hired is currently sitting in their house, waiting for them to return when he is going to open fire and kill Bart's family. The people in this picture with him are going to be murdered literally hours later, and he knows it. Bart was convicted in 2007 for hiring the hitman and was given the death penalty, but 40 minutes before his execution, the governor of Texas commuted his sentence to a life sentence because, oddly enough, Bart's own father, one of the people he tried to have killed, had forgiven him and did not want to see his last remaining family member be executed. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. And if you haven't done this already, please RSVP as single to the Like Button's wedding, but then show up with a +1. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, guys, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to share with you the picture or video that is famously associated with them. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story,
Professor is now in-game. Get the best builds and push runes and items to match your playstyle. Know your teammates and enemies right from the get-go with smart tags. Use it for counterplays. Track your gameplay in real time and see what to focus on. And compare yourself to others playing the same champ and role. Outsmart your opponents with Professor.
If you weren't already afraid of the woods, you will be by the end of this video. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please release a massive saltwater crocodile. So if that's of interest to you, please release a massive saltwater crocodile inside of the Like Button's house. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On August 2nd, 1963, 4-year-old Bobby Panknin, along with his 2 older brothers and his 2 parents, headed off to a camping resort on Deep Lake in Washington State. The following day, Mrs. Panknin, whose name was Edna, decides she wants to take her 3 sons down a logging road that was right behind their campsite that she had heard fed out to this beautiful little waterfall that she thought her sons would like to see. Edna gets the boys ready, she says bye to Mr. Panknin, and then she and her sons take off down this logging road. And as soon as she's on the road, it occurs to her that it's totally overgrown, the grass is really high, it's rocky and bumpy, and she's thinking to herself, there's no way any vehicle is getting down this road, and probably there's been no vehicles on this road for a very long time. This is a very isolated place on this campsite. So they walk for a little ways on this overgrown logging road until they see there's a turnoff that leads down to the water and this little waterfall. And so right away she saw there was all this brush they were going to need to walk through, and the ground looked pretty rough. And Bobby, her youngest, the 4-year-old, he didn't have shoes on. He was going through a phase where he refused to wear shoes, and so it hadn't really mattered the entire duration of walking up the road, but it seemed like this might be too much for him to walk on. And so she told Bobby to wait on the road, and she told her other son, Jimmy, the 6-year-old, to wait next to him. Those two would stay on the road together, while she and Bill, the 10-year-old, would go past the brush, go down to the water, check it out for a couple of minutes, and then she would come back, she would pick up Bobby, and Jimmy would come along, and then they would go down and look at the water, and then they would leave. Bobby didn't seem to mind, so he just sat on the road, and Jimmy was a little bit frustrated that he couldn't go with the first group, but he sat down too, and Bill and Edna took off past this brush down to the water. Now the distance between where Bill and Edna and where Bobby and Jimmy were was only about 10 feet. There was just this brush right in the middle of them that did obscure their view. They could not see each other, but they are very close to each other. And so Jimmy is sitting next to Bobby, and he's getting increasingly more and more restless. He wants to go down and look at the waterfall. He wants to be down there with his older brother and his mom. And so at some point, he just can't take it anymore. And Jimmy does something that to this day, he regrets every single day. And that is, he got up and left his brother. He went through the brush down to where Bill and Edna were. And as soon as Edna saw him, she was mad at him, and she goes, "What? You left Bobby up there? Come on." And so they turned around after about 60 seconds and went right back up. And when they got back, Bobby was gone. And at first, they're not like, "Oh my goodness, someone's abducted Bobby," because there's no one on this road. They've come up here and recognized that it's very remote, it's isolated, there's no cars that come through here, they hadn't heard anything. And so their first instinct was, okay, he probably got up, and is behind a tree, or he walked down the hill over here, or he's nearby. And so they're yelling for him, they're walking around, and no one's panicking yet. In fact, really, Edna was just annoyed with Jimmy that he had left, Bobby, and that he's to blame right now, but it's just an inconvenience at this point. But after a couple of minutes, when they can't get Bobby to yell back where he is, they start to realize they might have a problem here. And so Edna becomes more panicked, and she's yelling at the top of her lungs for her son. She's having her other two sons go look down by the water, go look over there, but there's no trace of him. And they can't believe it. It didn't make any sense because, he's 4, he's got no shoes on, they didn't hear anything. How could he be gone? But he was gone. And so finally, after a couple of minutes, Edna rounded up her other two boys, and they ran all the way back to the campsite where they got Mr. Panknin, and they hailed the police, and very quickly, a big search was launched up on that logging road. As soon as the police arrived, the first thing they did is they pressed Edna and the other two boys about, what did you hear? You had to have heard something. He was only 10 feet away from you, and he was within earshot of you, certainly. What did you hear? Did a vehicle come through? Did you hear an animal? Did you hear anybody talking? And Edna and the other two boys, they swore that they heard nothing, that they're just as baffled by it as anybody else. And so the police really didn't have a good starting point of where Bobby could have gone. And in that area, there wasn't any, steep drop-offs or obvious places that Bobby could have fallen into or gotten trapped. The water for the waterfall, it's not deep. It's this little tiny brook. It'd be difficult to drown in that little brook. So they just basically started fanning out in all directions, hoping they would, find a piece of clothing or some other clue that would indicate where he went. After 3 days of searching that yielded nothing, they finally brought in a bloodhound to try to find him based on scent. And so they had the dog smell one of Bobby's shoes, and the dog immediately seemed to key in on his scent in the area where Bobby had gone missing. And the dog turns and starts running up the logging road away from the campsite, so farther into the forest. And it runs for almost 2 miles. And it never seems to waver. It's clearly picked up Bobby's scent. And it stops at this fork in the road about 2 miles away from where Bobby had gone missing. And it keys in on this one area right at the fork where there wasn't anything significant. It was just this bare patch of dirt. And so the police, they uncover the dirt a little bit. There's nothing there. They're looking around the area. There's no indication that Bobby was ever here. So they give the scent back to the dog. And again, the dog just keeps tracking to this one section in this fork in the road. But they didn't know what to do with that information because there was nothing there. The search for Bobby was called off after 7 days because they could not find anything. And so the lead investigator came out and did this press release where he basically said, "We have no idea what happened to Bobby. However, we do think he was abducted." And his reasoning for this was pretty straightforward. Bobby was a young kid that had no shoes on in an unfamiliar forest. And he was only out of eyesight for 2 minutes. So how far could he really have gotten? Certainly not far enough that his family wouldn't have found him after those 2 minutes were up and they began looking for him. And so if you go down the abduction rabbit hole, you start with, okay, a person must have taken Bobby. But for a person to take Bobby, that means a person had to be in this area that was super isolated and remote, and they hadn't seen anybody in the area, and there were very few campers at the campsite. So realistically, if a person was going to abduct Bobby, they had to have been planning it and had to have been hiding in the trees and were stalking this family until they got to that spot where Jimmy left Bobby, and then this person, runs out of the tree line, runs over to Bobby, picks him up without Bobby making a sound, he muffles him, and he runs away into the woods carrying this child, all in a 2-minute window, which was a totally abrupt window. It wasn't like this obvious thing that Bobby was going to be left alone. It looked like Jimmy was going to be sitting there with him, which would have been a deterrent, you would think, if someone was trying to abduct Bobby. But nonetheless, this window presents itself and this person runs down and takes Bobby. It just seems like that person would need to be really fixated on Bobby, one. And there wasn't a clear reason for why anyone would be very fixated on Bobby or this family. And two, they would need to be very strong and quick, and agile, more than the average person. So we're talking like a professional athlete level of agility and physical fitness. And so while it's certainly possible that a professional athlete had been stalking this family and then ran down in this tiny little window of time and stole Bobby away without getting detected and then evaded the law for 7 days in the middle of the woods, while that's possible, it's pretty unlikely. And investigators reached this conclusion. They thought, it does seem pretty unlikely that a person did this. So they moved on to animals and they said, okay, maybe a bear took Bobby. And so they brought out bear sniffing dogs to search the area for signs that a bear had been there. And there hadn't been. And so they said, okay, maybe a cougar had been there. And so they brought out a cougar expert who looked around the area, and there's no signs of a cougar in the area. Plus, there was no blood anywhere around the area where Bobby had been taken. There was no drag marks where if a predator were to grab you, they would need to drag you away. There was no drag marks. So it seemed like, okay, the large predator theory also has problems with it. And so the next theory offered up was, well, maybe a giant eagle swooped down and picked Bobby up and flew him away, which would account for why maybe it was quiet and there was no drag marks, there was no blood, and why he's just gone. But that was when authorities said, okay, we clearly have no clue. And so that's why they gave the press release and basically said, we just don't know. And so while we probably will never know what happened to Bobby, it does seem likely that something took him. And whatever that something was, it was intelligent, it was fast, it was strong, it was agile, and it had been watching that thing. Because as soon as that 2-minute window presented itself, where Jimmy was gone and Bobby was vulnerable, it swept things so fast that they heard it, saw it, and it took Bobby somewhere and did something. Whatever it did, it probably wasn't good. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking.
Wait a minute. I'm about to ask you a question. I'm gonna say, does it look like my butt? Never. How long you got left?
I got like an hour ride back to the warehouse, and I got a couple things to take off. So I probably won't get on until like 6:37.
What time you work tomorrow?
I'm not sure yet. I probably don't have a route, so probably don't got.
Oh, look at you living life on the edge.
Ain't gotta be in at 2 o'clock.
I heard that. Yeah.
ally has been slain. An ally has been slain. Shut down. Double kill. An ally has been slain. An enemy has been slain.
Without a sound. Restraint.
You let your guard down!
Cut the last
Rampage.
tradition is
Killing spree.
ignorance is fatal.
An enemy has been slain.
No technique is forbidden.
Has been slain. Unstoppable.
Secrets kept, weapons wasted.
Dominating.
They followed the wrong master.
An enemy has been slain.
Balance is a fool's master. The shadows have enlightened me. I am the blade in the darkness. Balance is weakness.
Double kill. An enemy has been slain. Your team has destroyed a turret.
Do not deny me.
Turret plating will soon fall.
Now's my chance!
Rampage. Shut down. Your team has destroyed a turret. Your turret has been destroyed.
Brave the shadows.
It's not dented.
Legendary.
Tradition is the corpse of wisdom. No technique is forbidden.
An enemy has been slain. Double kill.
Secrets kept, our weapons wasted.
Your turret has been destroyed.
The shadows have enlightened me.
Dominating. Rampage. Shut down.
Balance is weakness.
Shut down. Shut down. Shut down. Double kill. An ally has been slain. Your team has destroyed a turret. Shut down.
What I have done cannot be undone. They followed the wrong master.
An enemy has been slain.
8 kills.
Your turret has been destroyed.
Ignorance is fatal.
You have slain an enemy.
Without a sound.
Shield to the face.
The truth lies in darkness.
Has destroyed a turret.
None escape their shadow.
Your turret has been destroyed. Your team has destroyed a turret.
No technique is forbidden.
I'll end this now.
Tradition is the corpse of wisdom. Secrets kept, weapons wasted.
Enemy double kill. Shut down. Shut down. An enemy has been slain. An enemy has been slain. An ally has been slain. An enemy has been slain.
Looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night, and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they're just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. At some point, they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are, and now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map, and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around, he's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going, when his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything. He said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight, and it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before, and so it makes sense he might be tired. But, they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute, and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated, and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense, and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before, when they were up in the tree, even then, it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here, and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of this situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders, and for 3 hours, James Sr. just continued to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son, and he puts his son down by a tree, and he sits down next to him, and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we gotta get ready for another night. We gotta get back up in a tree, and we gotta do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're gonna get James Jr. up into a tree for the night, because he's too weak to climb up himself, they both noticed these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that looked like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see, and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights, because these lights are their lifeline, and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him, to the point where James Sr. stops, And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest, and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes, there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by, presumably, his son. And so he's walking along these footprints and he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. What's going on with my son? So he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon, that the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially, the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin. And then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin. And so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about taking. And so the 2 older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the 2 girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the two girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the two girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside. And so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking we're gonna find her. So they go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking. And so they call the police. The police show up and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the third day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child...
You're off today? I thought you worked today. Make sure. Today's Wednesday. Damn, I didn't go work today. I got there 4 minutes late, and my apron wasn't clean. So they said, no, go today. Yeah, it's crazy. I thought you worked today. What's up? I work tomorrow. I'm gonna go on time. all the good ones. There's an egg in somebody's helmet. What the fuck? That's a rat tat. Oh, this is a car. I'm not going to the car right now. Who's that? You know I'm not going to pick you up right now. Wait, wait. Hmm? You just got home. Did you try to swap your shift on Sunday? Like Monday or a different day? That'd be better. If not, it's still fine, okay? This is a porn I want to watch. Alright, that's all. you did that. You pick your party, yeah, I'm so proud of you. Start saying that. We gotta say, you pick your party, are you proud of yourself? So make sure they recognize themselves. So as we read a post, it was like, instead of saying, I'm proud of you, you gotta say, are you proud of yourself? So they don't grow up looking for acceptance from others and only acceptance from themselves. So they're happy with themselves. They get motivated by themselves. I like that. That was good. Okay. use on the phone. Oh, just watching this car. Just watching this work car. Still watching the TV. Nah. What was I? You said I don't need to? I'm gonna go to like a hand car wash like inside the store. I mean that store like inside of the driving thing.